Welcome back to Crafted Reality, a podcast by Yellow Brick, where we dive into the world of play, story and technology, with me, Ali John, and my co-host, Julian Sykes. This month we chat with the brilliant Robin Moore, creative technologist and director of SHWSH, an innovative consultancy that works with artists, creatives, production companies and broadcasters. He's the former head of innovation at BBC Wales, where he developed and piloted the use of new tools and platforms to deliver novel formats and experiences for many of the BBC's biggest brands. In this episode, we talk about an abundance of things, from his journey from traditional broadcast to experimental formats, to discussion around content consumption, to exploring the meaning of R&D. So if you're enjoying the podcast and want to support what we do, we'd love you to check out our Patreon page. You'll get access to bonus content, early guest announcements, and the chance to ask some questions, and much, much more. Your support really helps us to keep the podcast going, so thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, Robin, to the Crafted Reality podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me here.
That's all right. It's an absolute pleasure to have you in the office. So we often ask our guests just to give us a little rundown on who they are, what they do, and it's basically over to you in this bit.
So I'm Robin Moore. I often use the description of creative technologist to describe what I do, as a way of trying to get over the point that I tend to work in two different worlds. Possibly even three different worlds. I started very much with a kind of an artistic intent, and did fine art sculpture for part of one of my degrees. Also studied marketing, which is I find interesting because I've ended up doing a lot of editorial stuff since, and I tend to find those two things very connected. And then by a very weird roundabout career path, partly down to the reality of not being able to get a graduate job when I left university, I started a business. And I'm a big believer in that things happen to people that do things. And because basically I did some stuff and then got lucky and ended up with a job at the BBC because I'd got into designing websites in the really early days, like pre-Google. And then just because of the position I was at, it meant every new technology that came along, we pretty much went, oh, how do we use that to deliver content, to create stories, to curate stories? And so I've been very lucky to have generally been across all that stuff. And so I've ended up in this position where really my career is made out of trying new stuff and working out what you can do with it, or whether you should do anything with it. Which is a different form of creativity than I probably thought I'd started off with, and I still am a little bit of a frustrated artist. But more recently, I left the BBC and started my own company, SHWSH. It's my second company. And really, that was just a way of extending being able to play with things.
I'm just so intrigued by your journey from working at the BBC and then starting your own company. Is there tell us a little bit more about that pathway. So what was the most interesting things that you did at the BBC, and maybe how does that connect then to the work that you do now?
That's really interesting that you've raised it in a way that I can actually say something more positive about it, because there is a level at which it is. I just decided I'd had enough at the BBC. I'd been there for 22 years.
Wow.
And it seemed financially like a good way of having control over my destiny. Yeah. But underneath that, there are some interesting things with working at the BBC, particularly in the last 6 years. I was a head of innovation at BBC Wales, which basically meant working with BBC Research and Development. Generally, they're the kind of white-coated boffins. That's what they're seen as. Some very creative people, but also some really academically, switched on people. A lot of engineers, and they do really interesting work. And I got myself a little bit of a kind of niche doing live versions of their work. So we would do pilots of new technology and how it might be used. Did a lot of work in virtual reality, spatial sound, and towards the end we did some augmented reality projects. But unlike just playing, which I still always do at the beginning of a project, we could often put a reasonable budget together in a decent team. So, for instance, I did an augmented reality app for the SHWSH, that was very specifically tailored to looking at how we could deliver content in different ways for different partners. So we had multiple partners, multiple types of content, which means you can play with lots of things. But we weren't really too bothered about some of the kind of edges of the technology. It was more about that, how do you curate and collate content in a way that makes sense to people who, in that instance, were coming to the Eisteddfod. I mean, that ended up being a £120,000 project. So a lot of the job for me was actually getting together all the partners, but it meant you've got a budget, but we actually had to make it work live for 9 days, and potentially 2 months afterwards. So it was a pilot, it's a prototype, it's a piece of research and development, but I really like doing those things that were still live, where you actually have proper feedback from the users, and you tend to learn a bit more because you're pushing at the edges. I tend to describe it as using the technology in anger.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and it's that thing of you're not just playing with it anymore. You're actually having to go, this has to work.
Yeah.
This cannot fall over. And we had to set up a Wi-Fi network for that. We hit all sorts of issues because the Eisteddfod, a lot of people set up Wi-Fi networks, and so. And that was a kind of learn, and you learn so much doing those sorts of processes. And really, I just wanted to carry on being able to do that.
Yeah.
But also slightly, I was a little bit frustrated that in the BBC, because it's such a big organisation, and because it's quite risk adverse, because it's seen as a trusted institution, that they often didn't actually reuse. Everyone would go, oh, that was a really successful project. Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, you did that. Oh, marketing loves it. We can market it. It's the first time we've done X or Y. But actually, they're not going to do it again for 3 or 4 years. And that can be really frustrating. Because there's some technologies particularly that I'm coming back to now and people are starting to do things. Thinking, we were doing that 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm thinking, oh, and you're only doing that now. It's more why haven't we done anything else with it?
Yeah.
And lots of people will be relearning it when it does, because the staff will have moved on often.
Yeah.
And that frustrates me. So I quite like the idea of being able to pick projects and actually go, no, this project we're actually going to do.
Yeah.
We're still with the same methodology. We're still starting with that playing and experimenting.
Yeah.
But that will actually deliver the project, which is what I can do now with SHWSH as a vehicle for it. And hopefully, I still haven't had the time because I've been too busy, hopefully do more of my own projects as well.
Yeah.
So I've got some kind of game projects and some apps that I've started getting to the point where I'm building and can actually productise them myself.
Yeah. And I guess it's really interesting when you're talking about working at the BBC, and do you feel that you could take, I guess, sort of risks within that role, or did you feel that it was kind of quite confined to a certain type of project?
Definitely in the last 6 years working for R&D, we were able to take risks. I think we were given the time to experiment, so you could take the closed risks a lot more easily than, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity, because this sort of thing, it's that first stage of a project where you haven't even got the funding yet. Yeah. We often could do that bit. There often was enough staff funding in there. And I was always having to bring in funding. It's not, it was still a commission-based structure. Even when I was in the BBC, we had to win funding for doing things. But you had enough bandwidth while you were doing 1 or 2 projects to be generating enough of a concept of what the third would be to get someone interested enough that they would fund you that last bit of cash you needed. Because you might have the developer effort, you might have an in-house designer, but you didn't have someone to pay for a license to a certain bit of software or do the user testing or something like that. And that's, user testing is, it's really expensive. So things like that, you get the cash in to do.
Yeah.
And that I feel very lucky about, but would get frustrated that they wouldn't then take the risks further down the line, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and to see how far you could actually really push it with the content.
And it's hard to take risks there with, I think, particularly I've done quite a bit of work around more factual storytelling, and obviously BBC is very, very strict editorial guidelines, which I find incredibly useful, and I can't understand why more people aren't aware of them and using them, even if you're making the conscious decision to ignore them. Yep. They're such a great basis, and that's one of the key things, because that's not my background, and yet I learned, and I ended up being editor of a couple of services. I had to learn that, But that's such a useful skill now, because
Yeah.
you get that eye for quality, but it's quite nice to be able to go, first instance, we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
Because we're saying it's fictional, but the BBC's very, you have to be very careful about that. Or working with commercial products, no, we need to be really careful how we do that. And it's quite nice now to not have to worry about that and to be able to go, well, why don't we just talk to the company?
Yeah.
See if we can get them to sponsor us or something like that.
Yeah. And do you think that experience, how has that shaped your approach to technology and storytelling within your own company?
I think some of it was shaped before that, in that I already, from the days when I used to use sculpture, was very experiment-led in my process. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker when it comes to creativity. So I'm basically looking for the happy accident.
I can totally tell that from your T-shirt today. Can I just say the T-shirt is like incredible. Just to describe, it's like a wolf with a moon. Is it like a werewolf?
I think it's meant to be a bit werewolfy.
It's just like the first thing when I saw Robin, I was like, oh my God, that T-shirt is awesome. So yes, sorry to interrupt, because it is just an amazing T-shirt.
It's rare to see me out in this shirt, actually.
I feel really privileged. I really do. Sorry.
It's quite right. Actually, it's an interesting aside that when I was my first years at the BBC, because I'd come from kind of more web design and I'd been selling my services, I wore a suit.
Yeah,
And I suddenly realised after about 2 years in that no one ever took me seriously. They all thought I was from IT because I wore a suit. So actually trying to dress down is sometimes
the irony. The irony.
Well, you're doing it very, very well and with much style still.
Thank you.
So yeah, creativity.
In terms of process, I suppose there's a belief that I can get the quality fixed. Partly, one of the things I've been really lucky with was I had some really good teams, and I started my role at the BBC having staff, and it meant that I could offload some of the things I wasn't that good at to other people. And I think that's often the problem with, I think there's an over-focusing creativity on the idea and the ownership of the idea.
Yeah.
And working at the BBC, I've got, because of the scale of the things we often were doing, you just can't do that. On the day-to-day, someone else is going to be actually doing the creative. Often my job was more creatively getting the funding in. And then it's quite light steering. If we were about to launch a site, I could give someone 3 or 4 pages of very specific issues, but that's not really about the whole. That's about the craft in a way. It's about steering to make sure the project is right and it suits the user and the audience at the end of the day. And so I was very lucky with that. But generally, the BBC is really good at being audience focused. They are very open to creative ideas. Maybe not anything that suggests you're going to deliver a new service or that a new functionality, because they're worried that people will want it, come to expect it, and then they can't cut it. Because often the finances at the BBC have been pretty much on a downward trajectory the whole time I've been there. So that's kind of always a concern. It's one of the nice things now. I don't have to worry about that. I have had some awkward conversations, not with the BBC, with another broadcaster, where they literally stopped a project because they saw what we were doing and started going, we're worried people are going to want this. We can't afford to do it. Okay, what? You're actually stopping this project because you think it's too good?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's crazy.
It must. It is. I can only imagine the conversations when they started developing iPlayer. In the idea of that, the streaming, system that then effectively. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but that's the only way I watch BBC now. I don't watch live. Well, analog doesn't really exist. I'm pretty sure it's probably very hard to get analog through a antenna from where we are. It's only through a cable, and then it's only in an app within an Amazon Fire Stick, so it's this kind of, for that particular one, if they hadn't have done that, I'm not sure where BBC would be today, in that respect, and that goes across, Spotify and their kind of like audio sounds and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess that weighing up of, like you say, what have we got capacity and budget to run and people to run it for this amount of time and develop it, and I guess like go up against people. I mean, maybe they weren't really the Goliaths that they are now, but go up against people like YouTube and people like that, and I think we've spoken about it before in projects where within organizations, when we're doing branding projects, when I'm working for Hoffy under Hoffy's hat, people talk about competitors, and they're very much talking about competitors within their own pond, but they're not and they're thinking their customer service is great, but they're not then thinking, about the Amazon customer service of next day delivery, and then this company's go, oh, we're not competing against them. You definitely are in a service sense. So then in the same way, you've got this BBC thing where it's like, it's got to be as good as what's available by all these multi-billion-pound organizations, So it's kind of interesting that, like you say, it must be a very hard decision as to what you invest in, what is seen as, I could imagine a bit of kickback from iPlayer back in the day, like, why are you putting money into, from the public, why are you putting money into this? I'm not on the internet, at that time. So yeah, I guess, like you said, going back to your specific, more recent example, the capacity and the investment needed must be crazy, to then go, oh yeah, this would mean we'd have to do this, and this, Yeah, I don't know. Just as a side, I've always thought that, and I've always thought that people are quite often siloed in their thinking as to what's impacting their experience. And I guess more so that must be across the board with the work that you've done with BBC over the years. Like you're always looking at language that exists elsewhere, in how people interact with the company and the organisation and other organisations and things. I don't know if there's a question in there, but there's some statements.
You've hit the nail on the head in that the BBC was brave in that it was following the audience rather than following the competitor analysis to a point.
Yeah.
Because Netflix wasn't really there at that point. It was more of a response to the on-demand nature of the internet that a lot of the discussions came. There were a lot of in around 2000, I dig out old slide decks, and it is shocking to look at. We were just trying to, what people used to call the martini moment, any place, anywhere, whatever it is, that kind of thing, which once in a while gets reused, and it's from an ad campaign in the 70s. But it's that kind of that we were having to push that a lot. And actually, in terms of the internal narrative, we'd been pushing that for 3 years before iPlayer got funded.
Yeah.
And actually, the BBC likes to see it as it was a first. I think there were some other on-demand platforms that already managed to just pit them to it.
Yeah.
But it was really brave because it was questioning their other services. They'd done it before with 24/7 News. The launch of the news channel, that had been a big shift, again, because of the internet. And then iPlayer creates that on-demandness.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, since then, it's been more difficult because they should have become an ISP back in the day when the internet first came out, because they would have had control over a lot more things and could have done a lot more stuff, and we'd all have a free internet service that we could use. And then if you wanted to play gaming and everything, you'd pay for a top-up one. They didn't do that. Then they didn't get into gaming when computer games really became the thing. They couldn't work out how to do social media platform and cut back when they were doing stuff that was useful, because an awful lot of people were using the BBC as a social platform. But they just went, oh, this is too much. It's too much moderation. It's too hard to do.
Yeah.
And so they're now in this difficult position where it's actually quite hard to do an equivalent to what is the iPlayer for the way that the audience has changed. And it's quite hard to do it because you don't control it. You can't become an AI speech assistant because you're not on the platform. People will use whatever's on their platform. And that's really difficult for them, I think. But there's something in creativity that sometimes you have to think of the solution that's right for you in what you do in your market. And the BBC needs to play to its strengths of being a trusted provider of news and content and an exciting representation of life in Britain, through its drama output and stuff. And it needs to almost double down on that and not, so it competes in a different way. It's obviously not looking at the competition too much, but looking at the audience. And I think they do that, effectively a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, their shareholders, I guess, are the public of Britain, aren't they? And I think that's not necessarily that shareholder of Britain isn't looking for profit, whereas, the Netflix and the Amazon shareholder is clearly looking for investment profit. It's interesting, and we've spoken about it recently in terms of not wanting to go all the way down the rabbit hole of this, but it's kind of super interesting how the Netflix of the world and the Amazon of the world have now effectively taken saturation and then kind of gone back to the traditional model of advertising within TV, and also making things effectively launching at certain times, and every weekly, instead of binge watching. It's fascinating how, particularly the Disney ones, for example, the first 3 episodes are given, when it launches, and then weekly after that. It'd be interesting to see how that model, they continue, because I find myself watching the first 3 and then that's it. I totally forget about it. Yeah. Like, it hasn't become a weekly thing. It's not like, I would say the peak one, and I don't think it's been surpassed since, and I'm wondering if it ever will be the HBO Game of Thrones. That's probably the last time I can remember, where actually it was a Coronation Street night, Yeah. It was a moment where everyone was like, "Did you watch it last night? No, don't talk to me then." And no spoilers, and then running away because they didn't want someone to spoil the episode for them.
For the whole day, so you just don't catch anything from anyone.
And then you walk home with like, "Oh shit!" You just see like a clip of it or something. That's the last time I can think of that kind of overarching experience where everyone was invested in it.
Yeah.
For better or worse. And I don't know, again, I guess it comes back to maybe some of the questions we'll talk about in a sec about it probably was the story, it was that, irrespective of how it was delivered or anything like that, it was the story that captured millions, really.
I wonder if there's just something also in that time gap, isn't it, between like that episode ending and then you having time to almost process that. And then that anticipation of, okay, what's going to happen next is kind of part of the suspense of it. Whereas I think when you binge watch, you absolutely lose that, because you can just go, I'm just going to press play and I'm going to exactly see now what's going to happen and what's going to unravel. And I think that worked well for Game of Thrones, because they often wrote really good hooks at the end for you to just hang in suspense, to absolutely want more, to be totally engaged, to wait for that week and then to come back to it and to be like, I am here for it and ready. So I don't know if that's sort of what a lot of dramas or fictional pieces of television now just don't have, because they're just expecting people to binge watch, because that's sort of the nature of how we're consuming stuff, because they're enabling it. I don't know, maybe.
I think it's a mixture of both. But I think partly it is just time has moved on, and we were more. I say we. There were a couple of the generations that were used to the idea of serialized content, and we were just at that cusp when the first series came out, where we were starting to see people drop things as full series. Game of Thrones has some advantages in that it was a book before, who a lot of people were into, so you had that minority going, "Oh god, this is amazing, we're all waiting for this," so you got all the hype, which helps. You also, it's one of those things you really had to invest in to understand what the hell was going on, and that helps. The more, obviously, it's a well-known thing that the more you can get the audience to invest in something, the more likely they'll give back. They'll give you more back in the long term. So I think it is a bit of a special case in terms of that, but it's partly also because that timing that we've moved away from that, where we are now expecting more. Do you decide to watch a film? Oh, we haven't quite got long enough to watch a film. Well, we can watch 2 episodes of Game of Thrones. Whatever. And I suppose that's a slight change in behaviour. I've also found it weird that second screening now is coming so much in that something like Game of Thrones is quite hard to watch, because you have to be really focusing. And it's harder and harder for people to break that away from the other screen being there and actually work with full concentration. I worry slightly for the BBC that they've got a problem because they don't do adverts. Adverts are a way of breaking up a programme that actually means you can make less program in a way, and you get these reminder points during the programme. Where we come back and we just, where were we? And there's something about not having that that actually makes it harder for second screen viewing. Which I think, again, is it could become one of these generational things where we see it's hard to make a program that actually works for 2 generations.
Yeah.
And we'll start seeing that move towards we're actually going to play out a slightly different edit on these platforms. And at the moment, because of the way creative control works, it's hard to get people to do that.
Yeah.
Because they have one vision for what the whole thing is, and it's something I've definitely battled with. That idea of creative control is, oh no, this is a TV program. We're saying, no, actually this would work better as a game plus a whatever, and we want the game to go first. Oh no, because those people have spent decades honing a set of skills that allow them to have that vision where they write a story and they understand with the right direction, the right things, what that whole goes together. When actually you've got a younger generation who are wanting to consume content in a really different way.
Yeah.
And they, you have to actually be able to write a world and then spin that world out into different platforms.
Yeah.
And think about the journeys between those platforms, which I think you touched on a second ago. It's this idea of what is that wider story that's happening? What are people doing between? Were you thinking about it? Are you running away from your friends who are trying to tell you spoilers? That's all part of the story, and that's one of the things I've really learned over the years is to look for the bigger story, and not focus on the story you want to tell. That's just a layer in this larger story that is really about. The first time I heard about something, I think of it like it's like the dust jacket of the book. What's the dust jacket of the book of that story? Because that's telling me some of the story, enough to get me interested, but possibly it's misleading me. And that's part of the story for me as an individual. And yet the author often doesn't see it like that because they have to write a great product as the product itself.
Yeah.
But I think now the audience is so literate, their lives are so complex and so filled with media that we need to be able to see those bits of stories, and the really good showrunners, the really good, people who kind of design those whole things are thinking about what the press release is going to be. And I swear, I'm not sure if it's true, but I swear in the early days of Doctor Who coming back, that particularly Julia Gardner and Rusty Davies were going in and going, that bit there, that's for the Mirror, that's for the Sun, that'd be a really good behind the scenes, and it feels like particularly Russell T Davies's stuff is written for the promo as much as it's written. Sometimes it feels like it slightly falls apart when you watch the whole episode. It feels like he shunted 3 ideas together, but they work so well in the promo because the promo will take you places, and it almost is setting up so that you get the closure of the story not being what you thought it was. But it's quite hard to tell a story that you don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a real art, and that's probably the higher form of creativity that's happening now, when an awful lot of us are just doing the craft.
I think it feels really similar conversations to when we've discussed work within street games. I think specifically because of the nature of we can't control the middle bit, so we can't control between 2 locations generally, because we can't control how the group of players, where they walk, how they walk, who's in the group. We can't really control what they're listening to or what they're chatting about. They could literally be chatting about Game of Thrones in between 2 locations on a scientific research exploration project, street game. You just can't do that. Or they could be talking about what they're going to have for tea. It could be those kind of things. And I think when we've spoken about this kind of work, it feels almost like you're creating these scenes that you want them to feel. And they can be heroic moments that they feel like there's one person. So, I mean, one of the ones I always remember was when we were working with Gerald Tyler, and he'd managed to wangle a vegetarian sausage into an envelope, and on the envelope it said only to be used in, or only to be opened in, extreme dramatic circumstances. And he'd given this one person in each team this sausage, and lo and behold, about 4 locations later, he meets a guy with a barbecue. And this guy he doesn't prompt them at all. He just says, I hope this is an extreme circumstance. And then this guy goes, aha, he opens it up and there's this sausage. And these kind of hero moments, or these like vignettes, or whatever you want to call them, mini ideas, it almost feels like the fragmentation of narrative in a traditional three act kind of thing is almost, for us, I mean, I guess that's why we've been developing some project like The Field, developing these things where it's moment to moment and we don't actually have the middle and beginning. We have these moments where people like peak up, dull down, or calm down, and then those kind of things. So maybe it's the same thing, but it feels slightly different. And I think it feels different because I think, like you were saying, there's people there that have worked for 20 years, 10 years, being filmmakers, therefore at least 90 minutes, that kind of thing. And you're like, no, these guys are going to be in and out in 2 minutes. And you're like, what? It's a different beast, I think.
Yeah, it is. And I guess then in and around then all of these different technologies, I think what has happened is people are still writing using those methodologies and trying to fit it into these technologies, which kind of have really different rule sets and different ways of interacting. And I think we're not quite there yet with a lot of things. I think a lot of VR projects that I've seen over the years are trying to still write a kind of either TV drama or theatre piece in VR. And it sometimes just really, really jars.
When you've got the full-on neck ache, the endurance piece of an hour piece, no one really thought about how heavy this thing was,
But what are the affordances of that then technology that you can, really get people to have quite a visceral experience within, and something that is very much about how you move or where you look, and so, but it sometimes just still feels quite flat. So my question to you is, when you're approaching projects, any projects that you've been working on recently, how do you start? Do you start with the technology? Do you start with the content? Or is it a kind of marriage of the two being kind of developed at the same time? Technology first or content first?
And I guess this is ideal.
I think. Yeah, because I guess it's not always that straightforward, is it?
For me, there isn't an ideal, because I like working both ways. Partly, though, because I tend to be working in collaboration.
Okay.
I've definitely got... that's become a weird habit, considering I first started my first company largely because I hadn't got on with other people in enterprise kind of projects and stuff like that when I was doing a master's. And it felt a way of controlling things. And actually, I've gone completely the other way, where I like the creativity that appears in the air between people when there's a misunderstanding. It's that sort of stuff. It's the when you can make something that I said that seemed like a good idea actually magical.
Yeah, and then you're that's exactly what I meant. Exactly. You're behind me in idea. You're like, how the hell did they come up with that? Yeah.
I mean, I definitely do a lot of exploration with the technology, and definitely in more of my artwork sort of stuff, it is very technology, and then trying to force it to do something that's beyond what it wants to do. So it is trying to kind of subvert to some level, but often it is easier to have a broad idea. I think the problem is if it's a story, and I think that is one of the issues, is I want to tell this story. No, what do you want to do? I want to change this person's opinion, or I want the person to feel these ways and connect empathetically with X. Okay, that I can get my head around a lot more easily. I think that's the sort of challenge you're alluding to, is this people are still writing these formal stories where they think the details of the story matter. Yeah. And the person has to get to X by going through, no, they have to get to Z going through X, Y, whatever, And I think that if we can subvert that process a little bit to say, well, actually, as long as they're going from A to Z, we don't care if they go through D, F, and P, or they go straight to X and Y. Yeah. And it's a little bit more I think, while it gets misused a lot, I think the idea of world building and that you actually really create the layered thing, then you can start exploring and getting those. But in the end, the story is, it's the story. The story is the story in their head that matters.
Yeah.
So it's not the story I write necessarily, but it's the story they consume is the end of it. So I could create loads of really scientific, technical ways of getting there. But if it doesn't make them feel the thing, what does it matter?
Yeah.
But I often do go back to the technology, because what I'm looking for is when the technology makes me feel the thing, and then I wrap a load of stuff around it. It's trying to go, oh, actually, So I did a project with Hijinks, which I don't think they'd mind me saying was too ambitious. They'd done a puppeteering project. They wanted to do something with digital. And so I literally just took technologies into the room and showed them the technologies. It was like, here is a way that you could just have any of the actors performing as a digital character within the play. And there was a lot of randomness in their process, which is really interesting and exciting from a creative point of view, in that they let their performers and contributors just play with stuff and slowly, properly R&D what the hell the play is about. And what was beautiful about that was, in a way, I just took a crash test dummy in because it was an easy model that was freely available. Not like free as in overused, but it wasn't going to be an issue, copyright was used, because I'm not a 3D modeler, and just showed them that we could set up a system that would, and this is a few years ago, so we were using kind of an online system. You can now just do it with your phone, but that would motion capture, and they could do it live, and they could have a perform, and you suddenly get these really creative people who've got very different perspectives than I've got, because of the diverse people they work with, and before you know it, they're doing little one-man plays with this character. So the character is life-size projected behind them, and they're just controlling the character, but they're controlling it and reacting with it. And you think, there's something in this. And I made a monster for them as well, as something to show that we can change body shape and body size. And they loved that as well. And they ended up coming up with a whole play concept around it. So really, creatively, I'm not doing much of the storytelling there at all. I'm just creating some things that are really interesting.
Yeah.
And what's brilliant is when the actor takes that on, and a good actor with the right voice, you suddenly believe that's a thing. Even though you can see the actor on stage at the same time, controlling it, you do start looking at it as the character, which is just puppeting. That's all they're doing. But the technology allows them to do it in a way that we could then subvert the point that you could see the actor, because we had another camera backstage, so another actor could take over. We just switch. And that's where the start, it's a bit more the vignette thing.
Yeah.
I'm delivering creative little vignettes that they can go. And we had something where, when the model got excited, I now look at it as really, really basic. These balls would start appearing on its skin and pop out and bounce everywhere. So really chaotic. And it was kind of like I could do proper, they're called Niagara in the engine, in Unreal. They're particle physics, basically. And I was like, I could do some particle physics. In a way, it's a little bit naive kind of thing. But they came up with the idea of putting real balls in a big net above the audience. And so you have, again, this, they're playing with the what's digital and what's real. So you've got this thing happens, and then it kind of, and they had quite a rude joke with them, sounds of orgasm kind of thing, and then suddenly all these balls drop in the audience. But it's really playful and fun. I love that. Maybe the overarching storyline wasn't quite so good because we were so led by those vignettes.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I laughed when I went to see it. People in the audience were clearly laughing. And so, it had that comedic thing. Whether it quite got some of the other things, and that's where possibly that was too tech-led.
Yeah.
Or it might have just been they didn't have enough development time. We ran out of time. We didn't quite get the icing. But those layers of you leaving thinking you changed your opinion about something, that didn't quite happen.
Yeah.
Also, it was very technically complicated. One person was ill, and they realised they had real problems putting it on.
Yeah.
Which was, I'm always into critiquing what the work I've done in terms of that kind of, because that's a.
You instantly know, don't you? Yeah. You instantly know how you would do things differently. But do you find that there's also? I mean, I can only speak for myself. Like, there's a there's a obvious knowledge that you gain from those kind of things, but whether or not you want to go back to it, I think is this thing. And it only happens, I think it's only happened to me a few times where I've actually wanted to go back. I think knowing is almost good enough sometimes. And I wonder whether there's that, not necessarily story for...
Do you mean the experience? Or
I think
I
think the projects sometimes, like I think there's sometimes projects that you go, oh yeah, if we did this and this, it would be better, and I kind of know what it would be. And then there's other ones where you kind of want to revisit totally. And I wonder if it's that is your internal story of you kind of not quite got resolution, or maybe that's not the right word, but there's something in it that you still feel you want to kind of explore. And I think that's where you were talking about earlier, the idea of this world building comes in. I think often you create stuff and you've already made a few decisions that are taking you into this direction, and then you're like, this would have been actually very exciting going in that direction, or world building this bit, because sometime halfway through the project there's a bit in the middle that just was like so good, you know what I mean? And then you kind of, but you obviously can't, you're then pushing towards finish, fundamentally, aren't you? And I think I guess that's the interesting thing for me, and maybe this is kind of a question to you in terms of the projects when we talk about R&D specifically. Almost the startup technology, Silicon Valley kind of, what we're going to do is hold our breath as long as we can and see if we can find something that we're vaguely interested in that we think has got legs. And I think maybe up until recently, people's understanding, and I could be wrong, maybe people more informed than me, felt like the person was always knew they were developing Facebook. The person knew they were always developing this, or they were building towards. And it's probably their fifth thing before they even found that thing, And I wonder how that uncertainty within projects, is that present in Wales, do you think? Is it accepted? Is it allowed? Because, fundamentally you're applying for funding, you're writing a synopsis of something you have no idea about because you're R&Ding it, but it has to kind of feel like it's finished, and then you have to you're then marked and against the delivery that you've said you're delivering. I don't know, like it's a personal thing that, you're obviously, that's the nature of the funding that we have, but I often wonder if artist in residence or equivalency of that is a thing, or should be a thing to consider within funding. I'm really going ramble.
You've really.
But I'm just thinking, I guess the question is, do you feel that there's enough true R&D in kind of Wales to the level where someone could have enough time to explore and get to those kind of really special projects?
Wow, there are a whole lot of things
I know.
I was agreeing with as you went along, and then I'll come back to the true R&D thing, because that's actually really quite hard. In terms of practice, I would say a weakness of my practice is a tendency to focus too much on the experimental stage of the R&D process. I can be a completer finisher, but that is not my natural state. So I have been an exec and have been all about the detail and making sure, and going back until it's right. And that was a good opportunity at the BBC. Was I ran services that ran daily. You have to hone, create, try new things, and that it's a different set of skill sets. It's enjoyable in itself. But I'm more naturally someone who goes, "You got that problem? Hang on a minute, that solution that might I like that bit of it worked. Oh no, it does this as well." And it's that bit is where I kind of get the thrill from more naturally. So I tend towards that bit of the R&D, and that is part. If you see it as the R&D process, to come to more to the R&D thing, people tend to over focus on the idea bit of R&D. The idea is just the spark. Generally, what you hope is that the idea brings together the right people and the right skills, and then you actually start developing it. Research is part of that. I kind of see that as part of the experimental thing, in that it's kind of like a lone experimentation, because you're taking all these little rabbit holes on the internet and you're going around and stuff like that, and you're trying to work out where the edges of something are. But then I really enjoy the prototyping thing. And I'm a big advocate for, and I do training sessions on this and all that sort of stuff on strategically prototyping, where you think about what you need to prototype, where are the questions you're not answering, and just go and make those things really, really quickly, which I find really exciting now. All the AI tools suddenly make it really easy to actually try things, not just paper prototyping, which is a good start, but actually really getting through all those stuff. Whether there is enough time for people to do that and the permission to do that, I think is a challenge. There are funders around. Obviously I do a lot of work for Media Cymru. Their funding, unfortunately, is coming to an end now. They funded their last batch. But that sort of funding at least is focused on that kind of thing. And while you do have to pitch something, what I think you're really pitching in those instances is an idea that could work and research that you will get value out of. So R&D should have risk in it. It shouldn't be a known. And that is a danger with some funders, that they're almost saying this is a known. But I think what you should always be pitching is, this is experimental. What is unknown is that we will get value out of it. A show might come out of it if that's what you're being funded for, but it might not be the show that you actually asked for.
Coming in with the programme. Oh, this is very different.
And I think that is difficult, particularly because funders sometimes, commissioners definitely, are creatives. So they want to engage with your creative idea, and they want to, and actually they should be doing it a bit later on in the process, but they tend to do it when you're funding it. And I always think that's a bit of a trick. If people remember that the people scoring are often creatives, that actually giving them too much of an answer can be a bad thing. They want something they can add their mark to. And so there's a little bit of that there's a little bit of a game with that about giving them their piece of the creativity. Because I found that, particularly working with more mature creatives, I found it quite frustrating that there still are people, and I'd learned to stop doing this at the BBC, who want to own the idea.
Yeah, we may have met some of those people.
Yeah. And that I still find quite difficult when they're very experienced people are still doing it. They're still batting down other ideas until, we've now agreed it's my idea, now you can all get on and do the thing. It's like, well...
It's difficult when you're third day in your workshop and the idea comes back around the table and you're like, okay, I thought that was done in the first hour. Yeah. We're coming back to that one again. And then you've got to... Yeah, we've gone through all these stages and we've got here. Yeah. But it's like, sometimes that's quite... that's, I guess, where the energy really kind of... You struggle, isn't it, with projects, I think, energy-wise, because it feels like you're Groundhog Daying quite often.
And often you need to... and I know I've seen you present. I know you do this. Sometimes there's ways of shaping a presentation, a pitch deck, or shaping a workshop, so that you're able to manoeuvre around those obvious things. Not in a way that necessarily says, no, we're not doing that, but is a way that we're taking all these things back, and then we're going to come back with something. And I think that's useful, partly being someone who's long in the tooth myself. I recognise that you want those older hands at sessions, because they're very good at drawing stuff out of the younger hands if you get the right framing. And they're very good at turning something that may be a bit of a amorphous, someone's got a wacky great thing that's based on personal experience or a diverse perspective. They're quite good at sometimes turning that into the right language for the organisation to see as an idea. What they're bad at is they'll have had 5 ideas that they still haven't got commissioned from the last 20 years. And they'll keep on coming back to them. And I do it. And it's so frustrating when I see myself do it. But so you've got to manage them, because you need them there. They're actually really good people to fast track, because they're the people who can change the thing into the right thing. You just have to get them to feel some level of ownership, because they were in the room and they will help shape it, and not take the role of, well, I just thought you'd do this, which is even more difficult when you've got a very set deliverable, like a logo or a branding, because they'll have something in their head. That's just, it's a general frustration. Hopefully, if we can fund more people to do the R&D, they'll learn that the best thing in the R&D is when you're pivoting.
Yeah.
You shouldn't pitch to pivot, because that shows you haven't done enough research. But
that would be a great application, wouldn't it? We're going to change exactly what we're going to do every day for a year.
although probably...
That could be quite a good one, actually. Could be quite a good one, actually. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, I did many, many years ago when I used to write songs and see my creative outlet as being that direction before I realised I'm not great at carrying a tune and I haven't got fantastic rhythm. Which it took me until I was an exec producer and was having to criticise other people's stuff for me to realise how bad I was.
Is this one thing you'd always bring back in the room? I've got a great song for this project.
This luckily was earlier. But I used to do things like I used to force myself to write a song and record it every day for a month and stuff like that, because you do, it's a good creative technique, isn't it? And I still like that with experimentation. I'm just enjoying the AI tools so much because I can sit down and someone can say in a conversation, in a support conversation, they're just thinking, I might get to a paper prototype in 3 weeks' time. And they start saying, oh, wouldn't it be good if we had a tool that does X? That seems to be missing from the thing. I go, we could probably build that. And you go and use AI tools to build a quick prototype that takes a stream of consciousness from one thing and turns it into something else. And they go, that actually would fix part of my problem. Now we've got to work out how it works for the user and how we do that. But we've taken away that idea. Is that impossible? No, it's not impossible. It's completely feasible. And I just did it in 3 hours. And it's a different form of creative pressure because I'm trying to force myself. Now, what I'll end up doing is learning a load because I'm using the wrong tools slightly to do it. But actually, I've learned loads during that time.
Yeah.
So it's really productive. They're now more confident that the thing they're trying to do, actually there are ways of doing it, and they shouldn't be overthinking it. We should be getting there a bit quicker.
Yeah.
And I think that for me is a really exciting bit of process now.
What advice would you give someone looking to innovate in the storytelling or media space?
Think of the story outside the story. So what does the dust jacket say? And for you, that would be the first thing. I'd write a few versions of that and then kind of work backwards and then write all your perfect stuff and all that kind of thing, which you probably do anyway. It's that sort of the dust jacket thing. Or even better, what does your friend tell you that made you look at the dust jacket?
I like that.
And then think about, will you remember this on your deathbed? When is the last time you will think about this experience, and why would you think about it? What would remind you of the experience that would make you re-engage with it? How far can we lengthen that personal story that the audience member has? Really stretch it out. Definitely think that. And then from the point of someone who funds innovation, through various bodies that sit on panels, the main thing in that is just doing the due diligence, actually read around and realise there are, 5 billion people in the world or whatever?
It's likely things have been done.
They've always been done. And the chances are there's someone you can go and talk to and ask how they did it. It still means you're original, your skills are original, you're coming at it from a different perspective, but the chances are there's something pretty similar has been done. Go and ask them how they did it. And we don't do enough of that. We don't, we're not collaborative in that kind of way. There's still this kind of like, oh no, it's an idea, this is the precious bit. But it's not, it's your perspective on the idea and the skills you bring, not the actual idea. Or your team, if you work with a team. Always work with a team. Innovation is far too important to be left to individuals.
And on that note, my friends, thank you so much for coming in to chat with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Crafted Reality. If you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe and share it with your friends. And of course, if you want to support the podcast and access exclusive content, head over to our Patreon page. We'll be back next month.